Hi, this is Adam Law with another Torah video for you for wanderings. Today's video is Vayikra. Sacrifices? Seriously? The idea of having sacrifices in religion is something that's very difficult for a modern person. Thinking this idea that we're bringing sacrifice of animals in a temple and cutting them up and burning them up to God and then the priests would eat them, this seems like a very strange thing for the modern person. Especially because we don't really see any religions nowadays that do this, and we're already 2,000 years removed from our holy temple itself. So what is sacrifices all about? That's what I'm going to speak about today in Parshas Vayikra. Again, if you like my content, I want you to know that years of study and scholarship and a lot of work went into making these videos, so I would appreciate if you would like, subscribe, comment, and share on my videos. I have two video channels, both this one, Adam Law, which is dedicated to Torah, and one called Wanderings with Adam Law, which is about my personal spirituality and general content. So, and also, of course, you know I'm a psychotherapist and a coach, spiritual care expert, and I'm always available to help you. To set an appointment, please reach out to me. I will put my connections here. Okay, the topic again, exciting topic, Parshas Vayikra. Now, when I first started studying Torah 20 years ago, I always had difficulty with these parshas, these stories in the Torah about the sacrifices. The whole book of Vayikra, or Leviticus, is dealing with all the details, the ritual details of all the sacrifices they would bring in the temple. And it's just not so practical anymore. Again, it's a lot of very minute details about, what part of the sacrifice does this, and for this particular circumstance, we bring sacrifices. Some sacrifices were brought every day. Others when people did a particular sin. So I'm not going to get into all those details here today, but I want to speak generally about the philosophical idea or theological idea of sacrifices, why there should be such a thing. Again, it's difficult for most modern people. It's interesting because for children, when they first start learning Torah, after they learn Aleph base, what do they learn? They learn Vayikra. They start from here. It would seem to make much more sense to start from Bereshis, Genesis, or Shmos, Exodus. Those are juicier stories, speaking about the creation of the world and the flood and Adam and Noah and Abraham and all these really interesting stories about our forefathers. And then the Exodus, which is the birth of a nation and the miracles where God took us out of Egypt and gave us the Torah and we became a whole nation of millions of people. And then all the other stories around that. That's such interesting stuff. You'd think you'd want to grab the child's attention right away with those type of stories. So why are we starting with Vayikra? Exactly. Because those other stories are so self-evident and so important and so part of our foundation of Judaism, of our culture, those you can almost take for granted that every Jewish kid, every Jewish person who has somewhat of a Jewish education is going to have some grounding in that. But we have to start them with the most recondite, difficult part of the Torah, the sacrifices, to understand that just as we don't know the sound of the letter Aleph or the letter Base, as Akiva taught the would-be convert, without the help of the rabbis from our Holy Torah, so too the sacrifices themselves are part of the Holy Torah and are just as much of it as the laws and as Passover and as Bereshis and Shmos. It's all part of the same thing. It's all a package. It's from God. It's a way to connect to God. And it's not just something that we can just brush aside. It may be less interesting to us nowadays because we are so accustomed to the culture where we want, these interesting stories, which is fine. But it doesn't mean it's not an important part. So I'm going to talk about the two prevailing opinions. Now there's so much. I could speak about this subject for the rest of my life of sacrifices and not really get into 1/billionth of what the depth is of this subject. But for very general purposes, I want to give two vastly different opinions about what are sacrifices, what's going on here. So first, I want to start with our foil, Rambam, or Maimonides. Rambam was a prolific writer, an utter genius in many ways, and he wrote two magnum opus books, both of tremendous importance for Judaism, but with a tremendously different response to both of them. The first one we all know is Mishnah Torah, which is the first post-Talmudic compilation of Jewish law. It takes all of Jewish law and presents it from beginning to end, everything, all the 613 mitzvahs, right? And he deals with every single detail there. No one else does this. Not everyone always agrees with all the conclusions Rambam does, but it starts a whole movement towards compilation of Jewish law. And it's a way to start thinking and making questions and how the Rambam come to this idea. But the Rambam also composed a second book called, of course, The Guide to the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim. And this book this book had tremendous controversy around it and still does to this day 1,000 years later. It's a book where Rambam dissects Judaism and the belief in God in the format of letters he's sending to his favorite student, and uses philosophy and logic, what we call rationalism, to try to explain Maisa Bereshis, the work of creation, and Maisa Merkava, the work of the chariot, these deep spiritual philosophical ideas of Judaism. And he covers many topics of Judaism. And a lot of his conclusions are quite controversial and different than what we are accustomed to now, and certainly what was prevalent in his day. It does have a highly logical, philosophical type of system there, and there's always been question whether we can use other systems such as Greek logic and philosophy to analyze our own system, Judaism. As a matter of fact, the Kabbalists in that more mainstream tradition of Kabbalah and, let's just say, mainstream Judaism, has always claimed that we have our own system within the system. But we have that element of rationality. Believing in God is a rational belief. But there also is an element of Judaism which is a received tradition of Masorah. He doesn't seem to be that interested in the Masorah, the tradition in the book Moreh Nevuchim, and maybe there's a reason for that. The Guide to the Perplexed is for people who are perplexed by how Judaism relates to rational, philosophical inquiry. Matter of fact, Rambam says searching for God, searching for the truth is the highest level a person can achieve, whereas traditionally Jews have always said the way to perfection, to reaching God, is through the system of the 613 mitzvahs. That's for a class for another time. Anyhow, what does Rambam say about sacrifices? Rambam says sacrifices were a concession for the natural physical reality that people were accustomed to. That people from time immemorial were always bringing sacrifices. And you see it, if you read the Odyssey, you see that the Greeks had all these sacrifices, a lot of them which seemed quite similar, lahavdil, to what we did. However, they were to their different pagan gods, the polytheistic religion that they had. So the Rambam says that the sacrifices were concession to the human nature, and it's really a higher level that we just serve God with our heart, that's the most spiritual thing. And even though the Mishnah does deal with the sacrifices, and the Talmud doesn't have all that stuff in there, it really does focus the Talmud on the spirituality, the avoda of prayer, and the mitzvahs that we're capable of doing as a main thing. So the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim says that serving God is mainly a spiritual thing, and the sacrifices were sort of a temporary concession to human nature, and maybe the highest level would be not having sacrifices, and that we don't need that anymore. And that actually makes sense for a lot of modern people, because we say we don't see sacrifices anymore. I don't know how killing this animal has any relevance to me. Why should I do that? It seems almost like visceral and physical. Right? And you also have to keep in mind that Rambam has a theme. Rambam is a Puritan. He believes that God is removed from this world, and this world is a materialistic physical place which is going towards corruption, inevitably. And that God is removed from this world. God has some sort of magnetic spiritual effect in this world, but generally this world is left to its own devices, with God intervening at select moments, which is unlike Aristotle, who believes that God is completely removed from the world, but certainly unlike the opinion which I'm going to present in 1 minute, which is that God is involved in the world completely. So Rambam generally sees this world and God as separate, and therefore the more spiritual our service, the more that we reach out to God spiritually, as opposed to physically, the better. So Rambam similarly has discussed for things such as sex. He has a sort of Victorian view of it, where he sort of thinks that it should be done minimally and only for a purpose of propagation, basically. And he doesn't see the beauty in that so much. So same thing too with sacrifices. He sees it as sort of like a lower materialistic thing, and since he believes that God is totally spiritual and removed from this world, therefore the sacrifices were like sort of a temporary thing, meaning like we had to get weaned off of this idea. We came from pagan lands, pagan people who were doing sacrifices, and therefore eventually we resorted to a higher spiritual avoda, which is prayer. And the sacrifices were just a concession for our nature at that time. Of course, this is a very big difficulty when you look at his Mishnah Torah, which is one of the only compilations which actually deals with the laws of the sacrifices. He deals with that there and never says anything like this, that this is just a temporary concession. Rather, he deals with every single detail. This is why Rambam Maimonides is such an interesting figure, is because there's so much contradiction, so much, not necessarily halakhic contradiction, but philosophical contradiction within his works. It's one place he says God's removed from the world and we're responsible for most of the actions in the world. And then in another place, he says God's totally involved in every detail of the world, which he explicitly argues against in his Mor Nevuchim when he talks about divine providence. So anyway, just at a basic level, though, we have to say that Rambam really thought that sacrifices were sort of at least in the Mor Nevuchim, a lower level, something was a concession, and eventually we would move past that, and let's just say the spiritual evolution of man. And Rambam's not saying tear out that 1/5 of the Chumash, one book of the 5 books of the Chumash of the Torah, but he's saying it's sort of a lower spiritual thing, and then eventually we'll get past that. So take the opposite extreme. We have the Ramban, and I think the Ramban in general here represents the normative Jewish tradition. It's very hard to just kind of push aside everything and just say, that was just a concession for lower times. And the Ramban says, Adarabba, Rambam, just like you think that sex is a lower thing, it's a physical thing, and really spiritualized much higher, the Kabbalists and the Hasidim after that very much believe that God was in this world, that God's in this world, part of this world, and this world is to be sanctified and brought up to God, but God is in this world, and maybe we're just sort of revealing God through our mitzvahs. Like when we say a blessing on food, we're actually just revealing the fact that God was involved in that food. It's not just that this food is some physical gross thing and we're just kind of eating as a concession to our body. Rather, our job is to use this food for spiritual purposes, to keep ourselves healthy and to do mitzvahs and to sanctify God's name by saying a blessing. So too everything, sex, every physical thing can be sanctified. It doesn't have to be this sort of Puritan, removed from the world sort of position, like the Rambam holds. So too with sacrifices. He gets very upset at Rambam for saying that, and he says, do you know how many mystical secrets are hidden in the sacrifices? Let's just give 2 examples of the Ramban's approach. One is, he says, okay, so you're slaughtering this animal. It would seem to me the Rambam actually has a proof for what he's saying. We see, I think it's in Isaiah, it says, I don't want your sacrifices. Rather, I want you to do honestly and stop being corrupt. Ramban says this is not true at all. God's light and life is revealed in the Torah. By the way, Rambam also believes that the Torah is from Moshe, right? But the Ramban says every detail is here, and every law regarding the sacrifices reveals a very deep thing about the way that God wants us to fix and sanctify the world and bring this world back to connect up to God again. So regarding the sacrifices, for instance, say a person did a sin and they bring a certain sacrifice, they're not just sacrificing this animal and they're done with it. It's not like just going to shul and doing lip service and pretending you're praying but really not thinking about business the whole time or what TV show you're interested in. He's actually saying that you're supposed to, Ramban says when you put your hands on an animal's head before the sacrifice, you're realizing that it's a tremendous gift that God let you live and this animal die in your place. And when you kill the animal, you're supposed to think that you yourself were being killed because of the things that you did to disconnect yourself from God through the sin. And this animal sort of vicariously, like a scapegoat, taking our place in that thing. So it could be a very spiritual thing. Again, if you're like Rambam and you just want to say the whole thing is just like, again, if you just want to say the whole thing is like a ritual thing, I hear it. But if you understand that Ramban says we should take this utter realization and humility when we do a sacrifice. And even a deeper mystical Kabbalistic sense, Ramban mentions and many, many others go on, that again, our job is to sanctify this world. And that's the physical material world as well. Like I said, when I talk about making a bracha on food, so too the sacrifice, you're sanctifying the animal and the plant and the mineral. There's salt involved and there's wheat involved and there's different animals involved. And there's these spiritual tikkunim, these fixings that are happening that are repairing and unifying the world. Whereas Maimonides says the whole world is going towards entropy, this whole world corrupts, is naturally corrupting. The Kabbalists have always said that the world actually does have that corrupting entropy, tohu aspect to it. But as Jews, our job is to spiritually connect and rebuild, tikkun, mitaking, the world back to a world of order and tikkun and fixing. And that by the sacrifices of doing the things that we do, really all the mitzvahs, we're actually repairing all these different levels. When we do the Torah, we're following God's will and we're fixing and repairing by following God's will and actually unifying and tying together all the disparate elements of the world and bringing it back to God and fulfilling His will through it. So it's not a temporary concession. As a matter of fact, it's the highest reality. This also may be the reason why we have an argument regarding whether in the third Beis HaMikdash may be built soon, the third temple, whether we're going to have animal sacrifices again or whether we're just going to have mincha, wheat offerings in the third temple, right? There's different opinions about this because the reality is, what is the role of this physical world? Is the world something to be abhorred and its spirituality is totally removed from this world? Well, Rambam might think like that, but it's really not such a Jewish thing except for Rambam's opinion. Most Jewish opinions strongly believe this world is a world to be sanctified. We don't escape from this world. We don't say don't get married and have children. We say get married, invest, have children. And it's not just that you're looking with your eye up towards God, you're realizing that God's also involved right here in the mitzvah. The mitzvah word means tie. We're tying together, we're linking God into this world, into our actions through this world, the spiritual avoda of all the mitzvahs we do, including the sacrifices. So that's the Rambam and the Ramban on sacrifices and why they're important. Thank you very much. This is Adam Law with Wanderings with a new Torah video for you. And again, I remind you, please like and subscribe. And you can always reach out to me for psychotherapy and coaching. I appreciate your watching and getting ready for Passover. Hope things are great with you. Be well.